All right, by show of hands, how many use CDBG for housing activities? Just about everybody. Figured that was going to be the response. So great, so this should all sound familiar to you. As we said before, CDBG is one of the more flexible entitlement programs, and that applies to housing as well. For those of you familiar with home, CDBG is a lot more flexible than the home program and what you can do with housing, okay? So we're going to kind of touch on some of those flexibilities as well as some of the nuances. There's also some different definitions within the CDBG program as it applies to housing activities, and so we're going to define some of that as well. So to start off, we're going to start off with homeowner rehab, which is a common activity under CDBG housing activities. There's many, many rehabilitation options you have to choose from for homeowner rehab, okay? Unlike home, using CDBG dollars for rehab activities, homeowner rehab activities, you do not have to bring the property up to code, okay? You do not have to bring the property up to code. So that cuts down on costs, but also cuts down on the types of programs you can run, okay? You can also have some flexibility with the types of assistance you're offering. So you can do grants, you can do loans, you can do loan guarantees, interest subsidies. There's a variety of financing mechanisms that you can use to fund homeowner rehab activities, okay? Because you don't have to bring the property up to code, you can do minor, moderate, or substantial rehab, okay? If you spend $1 of home on a property, what do you have to do? Bring it up to code. If you spend $1 of CDBG on a property, you're probably going to have little impact, but that could be it, okay? So you have that flexibility. It can be a substantial program. It can be something minor, okay? We're going to kind of get into some of those types of programs you can do, okay? You may not adopt the property or housing standards associated with your CDBG program. So again, some additional flexibility unlike using your home dollars, okay? You may include improvements to enhance the livability of the unit. What does that mean? Could be ADA improvements.
AC?
I'm sorry? AC, yep, yep. Some can be as simple as adding dishwashers where they didn't have dishwashers, or laundry facilities where they didn't have them before. Okay, that enhances the livability of the unit. Okay, so you can define what those things mean, but those are some common ones. Okay, so when you think about the housing rehab spectrum, and specifically as it relates to homeowner rehab, what's a relatively minor or minor rehab type activity that you can fund? Weatherization. Okay, that might be on the lower intensity end of the housing rehab spectrum. Obviously, if you bring the property up to full code, that's a substantial rehabilitation program. So everything in between those two things, ADA improvements, emergency repairs, minor rehab programs, however you define it, anything between those two things, you can fund with CDBG, okay? So now we have this term called reconstruction. What does reconstruction mean? Okay. Is that defined in the CDBG regulations? Oh, it's not. It's in home, yes. So it's not defined in the statute or the regs, but there is a document that does define it. It's called the Guide to Eligible Activities. It'll be on your USB file, okay? The Guide to Eligible Activities. And I think it's on page 2-83 or 84, where it gives a good definition of reconstruction. But here's what it says. It says, reconstruction is the rebuilding of a structure on the same site in substantially the same manner. Okay, and what that breaks down to is that the number of housing units may not be increased. So you can't go from a 1-unit house to a 2-unit house. But you can increase the bedroom size. You can go from a 2-bedroom house, if you're reconstructing the property, to a 3-bedroom house. Okay, that's allowed. You can't increase the unit size, but you can increase or decrease the number of bedrooms. Okay? Same lot, but the structure does not necessarily have to be standing at the time of project commitment. So if you had to tear down a property because it was dilapidated, it was going to fall down on somebody, and you had to tear it down, you can reconstruct that housing on the same site that was there before. You can increase the bedroom size, okay? But you can't turn that one-bedroom house into a two-unit house, okay? As long as you stay within the same footprint. So you can't take a 1,500 square foot house and then build back a 4,000 square foot house. You got to stay within the same footprint. But you can reconfigure that house, okay? Okay. So we talked about special purpose programs. Again, you can design your homeowner rehab program however you like. And what you'll look at is, you'll look at what's in the market. Where does the need exist? Does your market need something that's a little more minor repair, emergency repair type programs? Typically, we see a lot of elderly homeowners, some grantees will customize a program for them where they need AC fixed, they need hot water fixed, or they need their roof fixed, so they just develop some type of emergency repair program. Okay? So you got to look at your market, what will be applicable there. When you look across that spectrum, where are the other service providers? Where are they providing a service along that spectrum? And where can you fit in, your program fit in to fill the gap? Okay? Typically what you see is on CDBG, the gap is on the more substantial repair program. Okay? There's a lot of folks providing weatherization, emergency repair, energy efficiency programs, but no one's putting that larger investment into the housing stock, so you can customize your program that way. CDBG entitlement regulations do allow for refinancing, but it has to be part of a rehab activity. You can't do standalone refinancing. So if you have a rehab program, that's a loan. And in order to make that loan affordable to that homeowner, you have to refinance some of the existing debt on the property. You can do that. But you can't do refinance only. It has to be tied to rehab. So what are some eligible costs associated with homeowner rehab? So soft costs and hard costs are eligible. We talked a little bit about this before. Things like homeowner warranty and premiums, those are eligible. Hazard insurance premiums, paying those premiums, that's eligible. Lead-based paint testing and abatement, specifically if there's children under the age of 6 in the house, you can pay for that. Purchase of construction equipment, not eligible. Remember we talked about that earlier? These are one of these generally ineligible activities. But you can lease equipment, okay? You can lease equipment. That is eligible costs associated with that rehab activity. You can lease equipment to carry out that activity or pay for the lease of a contractor that's going to work on that property, okay? So tool lending programs are okay, leasing equipment is okay. Okay. There's specific guidance on eligible rehab costs and cost principles, 2 CFR 200. Rudy's going to touch on some of that when he does financial management. Yes?
So if a resident calls and said that they can't afford their hazard insurance for the year, we're allowed to do that?
If it's part of a rehab activity.
Oh, okay, but not outside. It's not like an assistance. We can't.
Yeah, you can't just do that only. No. All right, home purchase activities. This is going to get a little tricky, so I'm going to try and break this down, referencing specific matrix codes for you, so that it's clear which activity I'm talking about. So there's 2 ways to approach home purchase activities under CDBG. Okay, and you'll see some of this terminology in home as well. You can provide assistance to the home buyer directly. Okay, so direct homeowner assistance to the buyer, or you can provide development assistance. Development is something that goes to a developer to build the property. Okay, so homeowner assistance directly to the home buyer or development assistance to a developer. Okay. In terms of assistance to the buyer, okay, this is where this is breaking down assistance to the buyer right now. Eligible activities assistance to the buyer. A direct home ownership assistance is now a separate activity under CDBG. Okay, it was recently added. It is matrix code 13. Okay, so when you go to set that up, that project in IDIS, matrix code 13. Okay, that's direct assistance to the home buyer. We're going to break that down further into what that means. Or, okay, again, still under the category of direct assistance to the home buyer, or you can fund that assistance as a public service. Okay, that's matrix code 05R. Okay. Just remember, if you're funding as a public service, it still falls under that public service cap, and there's additional rules associated with that. Okay, so we're going to break these two things down now. Everybody with me? Okay. All right. So if you're providing direct homeownership assistance, okay, direct homeownership assistance, up to 50% of the required down payment can be provided to the home buyer, up to 50%. Okay. How would you know what that amount is? How would you figure out what that amount is? Where would you get that information? I think I heard it from the lender, right? The lender will say, okay, they need this much down payment assistance. You can say, okay, we can use CDBG to pay up to 50% of that amount. Okay. Under direct homeowner assistance, you can also pay for reasonable closing costs. Okay. You can pay for principal write-downs, so soft seconds, acquisition financing for home buyers occupying the housing. So if a renter wanted to acquire the house that they're renting, you can assist them with that. Or the acquisition of mortgage guarantees and PMI. So you can basically pay for the cost of the mortgage guarantees and PMI. Okay. All eligible under direct assistance to the home buyer. Okay. You can do all of these things at one time in one transaction, or you can do one of them. Okay. It's really whatever the home buyer needs that you're assisting. You can customize your program design to only say we're only going to pay down payment and closing costs, just to make it simple. Where you can say all these things are eligible under CDBG, therefore we may pay for all of those things. Okay. You got to determine what's the best way to structure your program. Okay. As a public service, okay, under 05R, as a public service, only down payment assistance is eligible as an activity under 05R public service. Okay, you can't do closing costs, you can't do any of these other things. The only thing you can fund under 05R as a public service is the down payment assistance. But here's another caveat. Because it's a public service activity, okay, are you limited to paying for just low-mod income households? What's the requirement for most public service activities? 51%. Okay? So if you got a strategy where you're trying to create mixed income homeownership communities, you can use CDBG to pay for down payment assistance for those properties. Okay? As a public service, you can then assist households that may not be under 80% AMI as part of that activity. Okay?
So if you have 11 houses, you can assist 6, no matter what their income is?
Right. Yep. Okay. Another type of direct home ownership assistance is something called individual development accounts, IDAs. Anybody here doing IDAs? Okay, no, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but basically it's a way to help potential home buyers save for whatever their down payment assistance or expenses are going to be. And so typically it's them putting up $500, you matching it, and then other service organizations matching that, and then they build over the months towards home ownership. Okay, seldom used activity, but it's eligible nonetheless. Okay. Yes.
I'm kind of hung up on this term, required down payment from the lender. Is that the lender could just say, well, they need, let's say they need 50% of the purchase price of the house in order to qualify. I mean, is it just that arbitrary? I'm wondering if there's a statute or there's something.
That's setting a cap. So if the lender says they want to buy a $100,000 house, and with their savings and everything they're going to put down, they need $20,000 to buy it. This is what their gap is in terms of assistance. You can say, okay, we'll pay up to $10,000 of that. Now, obviously,
the other part going to come from if they don't have?
yeah.
It has to come from their funds.
Yeah, it has to come from some other service or some other entity that'll provide it.
You could buy it home with it?
You could, yes. Theoretically, you could.
I'm new to this piece.
Yeah. No, you could. So yeah, there's going to be a gap. And so either you're helping them set up something like this where they're saving towards it, or they got to go get that money from someone else.
I still don't understand the required. Like a lender could say anything. Is there some kind of they could say they need X amount of dollars in order to qualify. Is it just wherever their gap
So
is?
the lender's going to underwrite, right? They're going to figure out what they're looking at this house. This is what they qualify for. This is what they're trying to purchase. Here's the gap. Now remember, another big part of cost is closing costs, right? That's a high percentage of the amount. So you can say up to 50% of the required down payment, but we could also give you $10,000 in closing. That takes care of the rest of the gap. Okay, so you can fill the gap other way. It's just saying up to 50% of the down payment. Okay. Okay, so that was direct assistance to the home buyer that we covered there as a public service activity, as a down payment assistance activity or other costs associated with that. As development assistance, you can assist with acquisition with rehab. Okay. You can also support creation of new homeowner units, which was what? What is new construction of housing under CDBG? It was a generally ineligible activity. Okay. So you can assist activities that support new construction, but don't fund the new construction. You're supporting it. You're making it possible, but you're not actually funding the actual construction of it. Okay? So that's eligible as well. Okay? So you can do acquisition only if it's a nonprofit or public developer. You can't assist for-profit developers with acquisition. Okay? So if you have a nonprofit developer that's building housing or wants to acquire housing, you can assist with acquisition. You could fund infrastructure improvements, but it has to be in public ownership. Okay? So before it transitions to private ownership, you would have to assist the infrastructure while it's in public ownership. Okay? So doing things like sewer connections, water connections to the property, to the main line, you can fund something like that. You're actually not funding construction. You're just doing the infrastructure to create the improvements necessary to build new construction. Okay. Yes. You just can't fund the main trunk line. You can't install a whole new main trunk line for the neighborhood under this activity, right? Okay. And again, you can fund new construction of housing, but it has to be carried out by a CBDO as part of a CDBG eligible activity. And we're going to define what a CBDO is when we talk about economic development. Okay? But CBDOs are community-based development organizations that carry out 3 types of activities for a grantee. That's economic development, neighborhood revitalization, or energy conservation activities. Okay? So if that's part of that, their activities to build new housing, it's tied to one of those 3 things, you can do it. Yes?
I just want to go back, and I'm sorry, I tried to ask a question for the home buyer. For 2 questions, just because I get confused sometimes with CDBG and home.
Sure.
But if I'm going to do down payment assistance, just down payment assistance for CDBG, not that I want them to get into that house, but I don't necessarily have to make sure the home's up to code or our property standards when they acquire it if I'm using CDBG? Okay. And then the other part.
But yeah, someone else said it, but the bank will. They may not let you make that homeowner lend.
I can't say that's always true where we're at.
Yeah, it does depend on market, yes.
I was going to say, depending on FHA standards,
Yep.
they're different than our property standards.
It differs everywhere.
State to state are different.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
other part of it, we provide it as a grant.
Yes.
So there doesn't have to be a need based.
No. You structure your program how you want to structure it.
And the DPA question that I think was coming up, where it's arbitrary, are you talking about like with our FHA loan, at least by us, I think it's 3.5% they have to have down. That's like the minimum down payment. So that's what we would be looking at, 50% of that 3.5 down is. And the other part that you're saying is that the bank says to make this affordable, then that's the other soft second that you'd be looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah, you're trying to make up whatever the gap is.
But you can do just the down payment of the 50% of that 3.5.
Right.
And then if you want to make it affordable, then you can do the soft second.
Right.
Okay.
You need to, well, I would say you want to design your program so that you're meeting whatever the needs of the buyers in that market are. And so if they need the other half of the 3.5, as well as some closing costs or soft seconds to make it affordable, that's the way you should design your program. This just places a cap on the DPA, that's it. So approaches to rental housing. Similar to homeowner rehab and home buyer, many approaches. You can fund acquisition only. You can do rehabilitation. You can fund new construction of rental housing. We'll talk about that. So in terms of acquisition only, grantee subsidizes the purchase price. Okay, so you can support or fund or subsidize the purchase of that property. In return, though, you're going to ask that units are rented to low and moderate income households at affordable rents. Remember we talked about earlier, if you're assisting with acquisition-only activities, the owner must be a public entity or a nonprofit. Okay? Must be a public or nonprofit purchaser to assist with acquisition only. Okay? You can't assist for-profit developers in acquisition. So I'm going to go back to this one. In return, you're going to ask that units are rented to a low-mod household at affordable rents. What is an affordable rent under CDBG? Fair market rent? In some places, yeah, that's appropriate. So the CDBG regs suggest that you, the grantee, need to define through your consolidated plan what's an affordable rent. In most cases, their fair market rent will be applicable. So you can adopt that as your affordable rent. In some places, their fair market rent is not consistent with what's really happening in the market. So you can do your own analysis and say, hey, we looked at the fair market rent, but the majority of our properties serving our low-income population are exceeding that fair market rent. Okay? So you do that analysis, you define what that is in your consolidated plan, and then you update it however often you need to update it, okay? Okay. So that was the acquisition only. Under rehabilitation, so rehabilitation can include all these things. Okay, it can include acquisition. Okay, if you're doing acquisition rehab, it's a rehab activity with an acquisition component. Okay, because you don't want to classify it as 01 acquisition, matrix code 01, because then it has to be owned by a public entity or nonprofit. Okay. So if you're doing acquisition rehab, it's classified as a rehab activity. Okay. We talked about no property standard required with CDBG. You can do historic preservation. You can also do conversion, so changing something like a school into affordable housing. And we talked about you can do reconstruction and rebuilding the same size structure on the same lot. Okay. All those are eligible rehab activities. Okay. All those are rehab activities. Eligible rental projects, project ownership can be public or private. Again, if you're doing rehab, it can be public or private. If it's acquisition only, it has to be public. Mixed-use buildings are allowed, but here's the thing. If you've got a mixed-use property that has a commercial component and a residential component, those are two separate activities under CDBG. You must separate the residential from the commercial component of that property. It's still an eligible activity, but you've got to parse the activities out. So in IDIS, you'd be funding a commercial project, whatever that commercial project is, and the residential component. Okay, so you got to parse those activities.
What do you do with the contracts or covenants, and you try to keep those separate as well?
That's a great question. I've seen grantees tackle it both ways, where they have one agreement, but it parses in the agreement, or they have two separate agreements. Because it's two separate activities in IDIS, so therefore you can, but I've seen some grantees try to get one agreement that parses the activities within the agreement. Mixed income units are also possible. Again, we're not just supporting low-income households with acquisition and rehab of rental housing projects. Rudy talked about the standards for low-mod housing, and that 51% of the housing units must be occupied by low-mod housing, so the other units can be occupied at market. Okay. Special needs projects are allowed. However, okay, facilities for persons with special needs are not technically housing under CDBG. They are public facilities. And the reason is due to the transitional nature of the housing. Okay? It's a public facility. Okay? There's no gray area here. This is not one of those areas, no.
I'm asking for a neighboring city.
Oh, for the neighboring city, no, there's no gray area. The reason is that special needs projects are not permanent housing. They're meant for the people to stay there for a period of time and then move on. Okay?
So if they have residential though, in a neighboring city, they have residential. Long term, I mean, that's where they're gonna reside.
Under CDBG definition of public facilities, they are a public facility. But what that does say is that the new construction ban does not apply. So you can build new transitional housing because it's technically a public facility under CDBG. Okay? So it gives you some more flexibility there. So don't knock it. Don't knock it.
Build a 28 units, townhouse kind of thing. They'll probably really be SROs because it's an autistic village for young adults with autism and other mental disabilities. They'll live there with caregivers or on their own or with friends, whatever. That's, just to clarify, that's public facility.
If it's designed to be transitional, it's a public facility. If it's permanent housing and the idea is that they're going to reside there permanently, then it's permanent housing. But then you're tied to the restricted on new construction.
And permanent housing at the same time.
Yes, it could.
So, okay.
It's just if the housing is meant to be transitional, they're staying there for a period of time, they grow out of the program or whatever, they move on, that's a public facility due to the transient nature of the facility. Okay? But that gives you opportunity to use new construction to build that facility. Okay? So there's some flexibilities associated with that. Okay? So if it qualifies as a public facility, it's not subject to new construction ban. However, it must be owned by a public agency or nonprofit. Okay, that's typically what you're going to see anyway, serving that population. Okay. Eligible costs, very similar to what you saw on the homeowner rehab side. Hard costs, soft costs, all eligible. So labor, materials, and any energy efficiency improvements, refinancing if necessary and appropriate, as long as there's a rehab component. Utility connections, we talked about that. Lead-based paint activities. Any rehabilitation services, okay? This is its own activity in IDIS, 14H. If you, the grantee, are providing services associated with carrying out that acquisition rehab activity, let's say, so doing things like loan processing, spec writing, all those things that you would normally see in that type of transaction, those are all eligible project delivery costs. Okay? They're all eligible project delivery costs, and that's its own activity in IDIS. And that's 14H. So if you're providing that type, you can capture that information there. Okay, okay, here we see this word again. CDBG generally cannot be used to construct housing, and then it gives you the exceptions, okay? Housing as last resort, if it's developed by a CBDO, and the exception for special needs facilities, which again are considered public facilities under CDBG, therefore they're not housing. And again, you can use CDBG dollars to support new construction. So acquisition, disposition, site clearance and assemblage, and any site improvements associated with allowing that construction to happen, but not actually funding that construction. All eligible under CDBG. Okay? Mm-hmm. So housing services. So how many of you fund home buyer counseling services associated with CDBG? Okay, you fund it as a public service, right? What matrix code is that? It's in the 03 series or something like that, 05 series. I think it's 05 series. Okay. So you can fund that as a public service activity, or you can combine it as a part of the cost associated with another CDBG activity, i.e. 14H program delivery costs. Okay? What that does then, it takes that out of your public service cap. Okay, so if you're funding housing counseling and it's tied to actually carrying out a program, like those people that are getting that counseling are actually taking advantage of a property that was rehabbed with CDBG dollars, you can count that as a program delivery cost and it takes it out of your public service cap. You put it on the 14H and you can provide it out of there. Okay? But it should be a connection with another CDBG activity. Okay?
So if we're offering them down payment assistance, we require them to attend home buyers education, we can pay for that out of admin income?
You can fund it as a project delivery cost. So it's not admin, it's a project delivery cost. Okay? The idea is that you're funding someone specific. It's not just a general service you're providing to everybody in the public. It's people that you're actually serving through your home buyer program.
So 14H, when you go in order to not have to duplicate any beneficiaries, you'll connect it to all of the, like say it's related to housing rehabilitation, you'll connect it to all of the housing rehab activities that you have for that program year.
I'm not sure I'm understanding what.
So
I'm not an IDS expert, so I can't really answer that question.
Yeah. So you can only link it to one activity. Yeah. So
Mhm.
just choose one. Yeah,
Yeah. I know Rudy's going to have a whole section on IDIS, so you may want to bring it up then. Okay? Yes. As public service, housing services may fit under area benefit or limited clientele, depending on the activity you're providing. So something like O5U may be applicable, and I'll tell you what O5U is. That's housing counseling as a public service activity. Okay? As part of a CDBG or home housing activity, housing services must qualify under the low mod housing national objective. Rudy went over that earlier. If you're assisting housing, you should use the low mod housing national objective. Okay? If you're providing a public service, then you're open to additional eligible national objectives like low mod, limited clientele, or area benefit. Okay? If it's housing you're assisting, housing national objective. If you're providing a service, it could be other national objectives. Okay. So we talk about a lot of things you can't do, some things you can't do. I think we beat this into everyone's heads that new construction, unless carried out by a CBDO, is ineligible. Okay? Does anybody here have CBDOs that they work with? Okay. Direct mortgage guarantees are ineligible. Okay? So you cannot guarantee the loss due to a mortgage default with CDBG dollars. You can't do that. Okay? Purchase of construction equipment, I think we can all nod that we understand that that's not eligible, but leasing is, right? Mortgage or utility payments except, here goes one of those except clauses. We're actually going to define what this is when we get into other eligible activities. We'll talk about a scenario where you might want to provide rental payments or something like that, income payments to support an eligible client. Okay? All right. So again, on housing activities, the most common national objective are going to be applied, that should be applied is housing. To meet the housing national objective, okay, here's where we get into a little bit of a, I think Rudy touched on a lot of this, but just to clarify. To meet the housing national objective, the structures must be occupied by low to moderate income household. The structures, everyone circle structure. Okay, this is important. Okay, so in a one-unit structure, who must occupy that house? A low moderate income person. If it's a two-unit structure, who should occupy that house? Okay, if it's more than 2 units, 51%. Okay? So in this scenario, what if you have multiple structures? What's the requirement there? So let's say you have 3 10-unit buildings in your project. What's the requirement? So 3 10-unit buildings, how many units in each building must be occupied by low and moderate income households? 6. Okay. 6 or more must be occupied by low to moderate income households. Okay. So there's that structure qualification. Okay. There's a unit qualification within a structure. Okay. And then there's the structure qualification. Okay.
If the structures are attached, then the number changes to 16.
Doesn't matter. There are different structures, different addresses. Okay. So we're going to get into this a little bit more. Okay. So multifamily housing, and I think we've touched on this several times, but 51% of the units in each structure must be occupied by low and moderate income households. Okay? That's one requirement. Multifamily housing, 51% of the units. And the rents must be affordable affordable, which again, you, the grantee, determines what is an affordable rent. Typically, you use the FMR. You can do a different analysis to show that those aren't affordable. And you just discuss that in your consolidated plan, okay? If you are carrying out a multifamily housing project within an approved NRSA area, okay, that's a neighborhood revitalization strategy area, okay, which you're going to have a whole module on later, or by a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution, within a target area, you may aggregate the buildings to meet the 51%. Okay? So let's just deal with that for right now. You may aggregate the buildings to meet your 51% requirement. So let's take our three unit building structure one more time. Okay, so when we say aggregate the buildings, what does that mean? You're going to combine them all. So in the previous scenario, outside of an NRSA or not undertaken by a CDFI, we had 3 structures with 10 units. We had to have 6, 6, and 6, right? Mm-hmm. In this scenario, some units may have 8, one building may have 2, the other building may have 4, or whatever the gap is, 6, okay? So if you're doing it, carrying out a multifamily housing project within an NRSA, or it's carried out by a CDFI within a target area, you can aggregate the buildings to meet the 51%. How many of you have approved NRSAs? So this is a flexibility you can apply to that area. Again, looking at creating more mixed income communities, okay, as a strategy, okay? So it's a way to attract a different investment into that community, okay? Grantees may combine single family and multifamily units in a single calculation. Okay, in a single calculation. So it doesn't matter if it's a multifamily rental project or a single family rental property. You can still combine those, you can aggregate those up. However, we're talking about rental. There is no aggregation for home ownership units because the regulations require that a home ownership unit has to go to a low mod income household. Okay? So the aggregation is only for rental. You cannot aggregate home ownership. Every home ownership unit has to go to a low mod income household. Okay? Okay, here's another exception. You can assist properties with less than 51% LMI when you meet all these requirements. Okay? So you see the and there? You meet all those requirements. It's when the assistance reduces development costs of new construction multifamily rental project. So CDBG is assisted to lower the cost of bringing that development to fruition. The project is not specifically designed for elderly households. At least 20% of the units will be occupied by low moderate income households. And CDBG does not bear the greater portion of costs in the proportion of units that are occupied by low moderate income households. Has anyone taken advantage of this exception? Yeah, I don't see this happen all that often, but it is something that's there where you can not have to meet the 51% requirement. You can support new construction, obviously still carried out by a CBDO, where they don't have to have the 51% requirement, but they have to meet all these other requirements, okay? And basically, the way I've been told that that's why this is here is that if there's no other way for that project to happen but through the investment of your CDBG dollars, okay, and that loss of not having this project would be a detriment to your community, you could support it with CDBG dollars if it meets all these requirements, okay? Housing national objectives, some activities may qualify under slum blight. Rudy kind of talked to you guys about the definition of slum blight and what would qualify under that. So some area or spot would be eligible. So under area, again, area must meet slum blight requirements, and the rehab must be designed to address the deterioration defined in your area analysis. The building must be substandard. So again, meeting your definition of substandard. And all deficiencies must be addressed before any critical or less critical work is done. Okay, so you got to address the deficiencies first. That meets the definition of the substandard. And then you can start on the less critical stuff associated with the rehab. If it's a spot basis, the rehab is limited to only the elimination of public and health and safety issues. So you're really just trying to address whatever this health and safety concerns in, whether it's faulty electricity, plaster or something falling off the ceiling, whatever's causing that health and safety issue, you can only address it if you're qualifying the activity under the spot rehab national objective. Okay, so that's the first part of that module done. Housing is done. Now we're getting to other real property activities, okay? We talked about acquisition. Just to clarify, acquisition is possible when it meets a national objective based on the end use. Okay, based on the end use. You can acquire a property, for instance, to tear down whatever structure's on it. And your intent may be to then develop, a public facility on that site or something. Okay? The acquisition alone doesn't qualify the property under national objective. It's whatever the end use is. So you may have some interim uses where you tear something down, you turn it into green space. That's one end use or interim use. But let's say a year later, 2 years later, you decide to develop something on that property. You have to qualify that next activity based on that use of that you're going to pursue. So if you're developing, tearing it down, it's turning into green space, that's probably a public facility activity. Okay? If you're tearing it down, turning it into green space with the intent or with the hope that you're going to turn it into a public facility or housing, you have to qualify based on that end use of that property. Okay? So it could be an interim use and there could be an end use. Okay? And Rudy's going to talk about change of use tomorrow and how that gets triggered. Okay? Disposition involves selling property assisted with CDBG. Okay? So let's say you acquired a property and you're selling it with CDBG dollars. You can also pay for the transfer costs such as legal costs or docs associated with carrying out that transaction. Okay, so you can assist, if you acquired it, assist it with CDBG dollars and you want to sell it, you can assist that sale and the financing and the other fees and everything associated with carrying out that sale. Yes?
If you purchase a vacant property for housing or public facility, whatever it is, if the property is vacant when you go to purchase it, you have to follow URA.
The property is vacant? No. There's nobody to relocate.
Reporting beneficiaries on that in another session, or?
Reporting beneficiaries of what?
If you're acquiring a property and the end use is you're going to demo it or whatever, how do you, we've done that a lot, where the acquired property is going to be demoed or rehab, but most of the time there are rental tenants that are in the unit if it's occupied. We relocate those tenants. For the acquisition activity, how are you reporting the beneficiary? Who do you decide that the beneficiary of that particular, I usually link it to the relo, to relocation.
Okay.
So how do you report? What if it's a vacant property?
So if it's let's stick with that. Let's not get into the relocation. If you're acquiring a vacant property, you're going to qualify that property based on whatever the intent is with that property after you acquire it. So you would document that it's going to meet whatever national objective you want to qualify it under. If it's a public facility, maybe it's low mod area, maybe it's limited clientele. If you're going to build housing, then you qualify it under the housing national objective. But if there's a gap in time from when you acquire it to when you assist that, there may be an interim use, and you qualify it under that. But just know that when it gets to your anticipated end use, which may be housing, you have to then qualify it meeting that national objective too. Okay?
So, a couple things.
So, in addition to those activities, you can also do something called tax foreclosed. You can assist tax foreclosed properties or NREM properties. Okay? So this became important under NSP, where you had a lot of foreclosures you were trying to assist, and the city had to take ownership of some of these properties. This is really a strategy to assist within that process so that these properties don't become deteriorated and end up costing you more to then offload them or sell them. So you can use CDBG dollars to cover the eligible activities for properties acquired through tax foreclosure. This is not something that's in the regulation, but it is defined in the statute. You can do essential repair of the unit, okay, essential repairs, or you can pay for the operating expenses to maintain habitability of that unit. Wasn't this one of those generally ineligible activities? So you could do it in this scenario, okay? And the idea is that by putting some minimal investment in the property now to maintain habitability, to take care of the essential repairs, you're preventing further deterioration of that housing stock, which is going to cost you more when you're trying to sell it or rehab it. So that is eligible. This now has its own matrix code in IDIS. It's now 19E. Okay? So you can set up a project under that. And typically, this is used to prevent abandonment and deterioration in low mod areas. The national objective is usually low mod area benefit. Okay? Because the idea is that by you addressing the deterioration of these units and maintaining the habitability, that you're providing a service to the area. You're helping those properties in that area maintain their value. This is not bringing down their property value, so it's seen as an area benefit. Okay. The national, I talked about slum blight may be also possible, depending on if this is a specific area that you're targeting. Or a specific property in general that you're targeting. It could be eligible in a slum blight area or spot. Okay, so it really just depends. All right, code enforcement. There is a CPD notice that goes into detail and guidance into how grantees can and can't do code enforcement under CDBG. Okay, it's CPD notice 14-016. And 14 kind of tells you when it came out, 2014. And what that notice basically says is this. CDBG dollars spent on code enforcement is not meant to fund a systematic code enforcement effort by the city. Okay? It's not meant to fund a systematic code enforcement effort by the city. Okay? If you're going to use CDBG dollars for code enforcement, you have to meet two criteria. One, it has to be in an area that's deteriorating or a deteriorated area. Okay, so you're targeting a specific portion of the city or neighborhood in the city. And the enforcement must be accompanied by public or private improvements or services. So you can't do a standalone code enforcement. There needs to be a rehab program that provide services to support the activity that you're enforcing. Okay? So if you're going to do code enforcement, you can't just have the stick. You have to have the carrot to go with it. Okay? You got to be able to say, hey, you've got to bring your property up to code. Here's your code violations. We can refer you to our city rehab program, okay, to provide services to help you with your rehab. Okay? It can't be systematic. It needs to be targeted, and there needs to be a service or a component associated with helping them make repairs. Okay? You don't have to fund the repairs, but they have to take advantage of the program or at least have a program available to them. So it's not meant to be all stick. Okay? Yes, sir.
Can I do it in combination with a zombie grant or zombie homes? It's going to be an activity for a short period of time, an 18-month window.
Is that focused on a specific neighborhood?
Well, it's the vacant properties all over town.
No. You can do a portion of those vacant properties and say, it has to be a little more defined than that. So the reason HUD came out with this CPD notice is because they saw major findings associated with grantees using CDBG dollars to do systematic code enforcement. And as a result of that, they saw high costs associated with doing code enforcement because all these code enforcement officers are operating all over town doing code enforcement. So that kind of gave them a red flag that, hey, this is not functioning the way that it's intended to function. Okay? So eligible costs associated with code enforcement include the cost of doing the inspection, so the time of the code inspector going out, carrying out the inspection. The costs associated with enforcing that inspection, so the legal costs, salaries of the folks involved in carrying out that enforcement. Those are all eligible costs associated with code enforcement. Okay. Typically, code enforcement using the low mod area benefit is seen as a benefit to the area. Again, the area must meet the specific requirements. You can also use slum blight area basis, again, meeting the definition of slum blight area. Eligible lead-based paint activities. So in the course of rehab, addressing lead-based paint hazards is an eligible cost. Okay? Also, addressing lead-based paint hazard is also a standalone activity under CDBG. Matrix Code 14I. Okay? So the cost of evaluation and reduction of lead hazard in housing, you can pay for inspection costs, testing, abatement, relocation. This is the lead-based paint evaluation reduction is eligible as its own independent activity. Okay? This is the caveat. When the buildings are not scheduled for rehab. Okay? This is something that's not already in your pipeline to rehab, or they're not already kind of applying for your program services, and it would be completed under that rehab activity. This is something that you identified through code or something like that that needs addressing, and you want to go in and address the lead-based paint hazards in that property. You can go in and do it as a standalone activity. Okay? Typically, you're going to use the low mod income housing national objective because you're assisting housing. Again, the same thing applies. Or you can do it as slum blight area basis is also possible. Again, must meet those requirements associated with that national objective. Okay. Historic preservation activities also eligible. A couple caveats with that. The funds may be used for preservation, rehab, or restoration of historic properties. And they can be public or private ownership. Okay. However, historic property is not just one that's not just old, right? It has to be listed in one of the either national registers of historic places, either state or national or local, or designated as state or local landmark or historic district by appropriate law or ordinance. Okay, so there are some criteria that that structure has to meet to be considered historic. Okay. So again, range of national objectives are possible. Low mod housing criteria if it's a residential property. Low mod area benefit or limited clientele or even job creation if it's a non-residential structure. And slum blight area basis, spot bases are also eligible as well. Okay? Again, You choose the most appropriate national objective for that activity. Okay? Renovation of closed buildings, I think we talked about an example of this before. You can use CDBG dollars to transform obsolete buildings into new uses. I'm working in several cities right now where there's a lot of surplus school properties. Okay? So I'm working with them now on how do they use some of their resources to address reuse of those surplus schools. Okay? So that's just one example where you can turn that surplus school into housing or some type of community center or something else using CDBG dollars. Okay? If it's housing, reconstruction, again, is not considered new construction. So if you're turning a school into a housing project, that's considered a conversion or a reconstruction. So it's not breaking that new construction exemption. It's considered reconstruction. Or you can turn it into public facilities, that's eligible. The national objective depends on the end use of the building. So whether it's residential or public facility, you're going to qualify that activity under the most appropriate national objective that applies. If it's housing, most likely it's going to be the housing national objective. Okay. Carry handicap accessibility improvements by removing barriers. There was one example I think talked about earlier this morning about what if you had to do ADA improvements on City Hall. That's eligible when you normally wouldn't be able to assist City Hall. Okay. That's eligible. You're removing barriers. Eligible under rehab activity if carried out under existing residential, commercial, or industrial property. Otherwise, it may be carried out as part of another eligible activity, i.e. public facility. So it depends on what type of property you're assisting with your ADA improvements. Okay, you're going to qualify it based on that eligible activity. Okay, makes sense? Energy efficiency improvements. Again, you can do a wide range of things possible here. You can do weatherization on a home or apartment building. You can install solar or wind equipment. You can finance energy efficient rehabilitation. Anybody here familiar with PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy? See a lot of CDBG combined with PACE now. It's a great tool. Established energy standards, including the recognition of the use of Energy Star appliances for buildings. So you can adopt a policy that requires green building or green building standards. You can provide energy audits or home energy ratings associated with your rehab activities. You can develop energy facilities. We had a conversation in our last training where someone wanted to create a, what they call it, a solar energy garden, something like that, that created energy through solar panels and was providing energy, electricity and utility for the homes in the neighborhood. It's pretty cool. The eligible activity depends on the type. So whether you're assisting a neighborhood or a home ownership neighborhood, really depends on what type of property you're assisting. You must meet a national objective, obviously, and it will depend on the type of energy efficient activity assisted. Okay. Brownsfields. I gave you guys the Brownsfield example earlier. Again, it's its own activity. So for those of you not familiar with brownfields, they're vacant, underused industrial sites with known environmental contamination. You see a lot of this on the East Coast as well as the Midwest, where you have these old industrial facilities that produced whatever, lead or whatever. And you've got contaminated soil, you've got a host of environmental contaminants associated with that property. And so you can go in there and address that with CDBG. You can acquire that property for the purpose of clearance and remediation. You can provide direct remediation assistance. You can redevelop for economic development purposes or other eligible activities as appropriate. Okay? The national objective is based on the type of activity funded, so whether that be economic development or public facilities, whatever that property is going to be. Brownsfield Economic Development Initiative grants may be available. I think the deadline for 2017 was February. So if you have some brownfield sites you're looking to address those with CDBG, you can also maybe consider the round of Betty grants that may be available, most likely next February. and combine those dollars to really create a project that will be impactful. Okay, has anybody here done a brownfield remediation project? What did you use? I'm just curious. What sources of funds did you use?
We had a Brownfield grant through the state of Ohio.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I see some communities apply for a Section 108 loan to help with their brownfield redevelopment as well. So, just depends.